The rifle cracks split the August air like thunder as Nora Daisy pressed herself deeper into the muddy creek bank, her heart hammering against her ribs with a terror that went far deeper than fear of death. This was worse than dying, and this was the destruction of everything her father had worked to build, everything he had died, believing she would preserve and protect. 20 yards upstream, 3 mounted men whooped and hollered, while their leader, a pot-bellied brute they called Greasy Pete, held her traveling dress aloft like a scalp taken in battle. The fabric that had belonged to her mother fluttered in the prairie wind, transformed from cherished inheritance into evidence of crimes she had never committed. "Come on out, pretty lady." Pete's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man drunk on power and territorial whiskey. "Sheriff Harry's got questions about that silver you've been stealing from decent folks." Nora's lips trembled as she crouched neck-deep in the green water, her undergarments clinging to her 22-year-old frame, while memories of her father's last words echoed in her mind like a funeral bell. "That land is your legacy, girl. Whatever happens to me, you hold on to it. Build something worthy on it." Now that legacy was slipping away like sand through her fingers, stolen by men who wore badges but served only corporate greed. 3 weeks she'd ridden west from the railway station at Bent Creek, carrying her father's Colt and her mother's Bible, determined to confront her Uncle Edward about the homestead he'd sold without permission. The 160 acres that represented her entire future had been signed away to pay gambling debts to Conrad Dietrich's Quicksilver mine, transforming her from property owner to trespasser with the stroke of a pen. Getting mighty cold in that water called the second rider a rail-thin scarecrow with rust-colored whiskers. Rusty Joe Pete had called him, and the name fit his appearance like a coffin fits a corpse. "Might catch your death if you stay in much longer." The third guard, younger but meaner looking than his companions, scooped up her boots and stockings with his rifle barrel. The leather had been her father's final gift before the fever took him hand-tooled with the care of a man who understood that good equipment could mean the difference between survival and disaster on the frontier. "Look what we found hidden in her gear," the young guard announced with malicious satisfaction. "Stolen property from the school marm. Seems our little thief's been busy." Panic rose in Nora's chest as the ugly implications became clear. The silver brooch that Helen Victoria had given her 2 nights ago, a token of gratitude for helping teach letters to ranch children, had somehow become evidence of theft. The trap was perfect, circular, inescapable. Her belongings became proof of crimes she'd never committed, while her nudity in the water would be painted as indecent behavior that confirmed her moral corruption. The shame burned worse than the fear. Her father had raised her to value reputation above all else, to understand that in frontier society, a woman's good name was often her only real protection against predators who saw vulnerability as opportunity. Now these men were systematically destroying that protection, transforming her from respectable settler into desperate criminal with calculated precision. Another shot exploded from the rocky rim above the bullet striking water inches from her shoulder. These weren't lawmen. They were vultures wearing tin badges, their black neckerchiefs marked with the crude pickaxe symbol of Quicksilver Mine. She'd heard whispers about them in the way station's Conrad Dietrich's private army men who solved problems with lead and left questions buried in unmarked graves. That was when the shadow fell across the canyon wall like an answer to desperate prayer. A broad-shouldered figure materialized on the ledge above the far bank, silhouetted against the blazing sun in a way that made him seem conjured from the very stone itself. Even at this distance, she could see the bow in his hands, the quiver across his back, the long hair bound with simple leather strips that marked him as one of the Lakota bands that still roam these territories, despite government efforts to concentrate them on reservations. War paint faded by sun and weather, but unmistakably ceremonial, striped his high cheekbones in patterns that spoke of rituals older than the territorial government, older than the mining companies that were carving up the landscape for profit. His presence transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation, introducing an element that Dietrich's hired thugs hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. The warrior surveyed the scene below, with the calculating gaze of a predator choosing his moment to strike. 3 armed men tormenting a helpless woman. It was the same mindless cruelty that had driven his people from place to place across the territories. And something in his bearing suggested he would not stand idle while it played out before witnesses who might carry tales of Lakota cowardice back to their own people. Without warning, he leapt from the 20-foot ledge into the river upstream, his powerful body cutting through the air with fluid grace that spoke of years spent moving through dangerous country, where a single mistake could mean death or captivity. The splash sent ripples racing toward the guards' horses, and Pete's mount shied backward from the sudden disturbance. "What in blazes?" Rusty Joe started to shout, but his words were cut short by another rifle shot from the canyon rim that sent stone chips flying into the water around Nora's huddled form. Strong hands found her shoulders before she could cry out, guiding her behind a boulder that jutted up from the riverbed like a natural fortress. The Lakota warrior moved through the current with surprising grace. His weathered face set in lines of grim determination as he positioned his body between her and the rifleman above. "Stay low," he commanded quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from facing death and walking away unchanged. More guards in the rocks above. They don't want witnesses to their sport. Chayton, though Nora wouldn't learn his name until later, had lived 28 winters on the frontier, each one leaving its mark in scars, both visible and hidden. The rope burn across his right palm came from a buffalo hunt gone wrong 2 seasons past. But deeper wounds spoke of watching his people pushed steadily westward by the endless hunger of miners and settlers who saw his very existence as an obstacle to their prosperity. "Who's shooting at us?" Nora whispered, her bare shoulder pressed against his buckskin shirt as they crouched together in the narrow space behind the rock. "Dietrich's men. They're not just stealing your clothes, they're eliminating witnesses who might testify about their methods." His keen gaze swept the canyon rim, marking muzzle flashes and calculating angles with a tactical awareness that had kept him alive through countless skirmishes. Another shot rang out, this one striking their shelter and sending fragments cascading into the water around them. Nora instinctively pressed closer to Chayton's solid warmth, feeling the steady rhythm of his pulse beneath her palm where it rested against his chest. His free hand moved to cover hers, a gesture meant for comfort, but carrying implications neither was prepared to examine. The current tugged at their legs as they prepared to move both of them, listening for the sound of horses circling to cut off their escape. In the distance, one of Pete's men spurred his mount toward town, racing to spread word about the Lakota warrior who had dared to interfere with official business. The race against time had begun before either Nora or Chayton fully understood what they were fighting for. But already it was clear that more than individual survival was at stake in the confrontation developing around them. The paint horse that waited in the cottonwood grove represented salvation incarnate when Chayton finally guided Nora to safety through a maze of boulders and rushing water. Dakota, as he called the magnificent animal in the Lakota tongue, stood ground-tied with the patient stillness of a mount trained for war, his brown and white patches marking him as one of the prized animals that frontier riders valued above territorial currency or mineral rights. Chayton's gear lay neatly arranged beside the horse, in the kind of precise order that spoke to military discipline and hard-won survival skills. A Winchester rifle rested in a beaded scabbard, while a medicine bundle wrapped in red cloth occupied the place of honor among his possessions. Most importantly for their current situation, a ceremonial war bonnet secured in oilcloth promised to command respect, even from settlers who feared and hated his people. He wore it only for public parley and ceremony. For any fight, he tied his hair back and left the feathers aside. "Easy, friend," Chayton murmured to Dakota as he quickly checked the rigging water still dripping from his buckskin clothing, while his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for signs of pursuit. His movements carried the fluid efficiency of a man who had learned that survival often depended on the speed of preparation and the quality of equipment. Nora stood shivering in her soaked undergarments, acutely aware of her vulnerability, but grateful beyond words to be alive and free. The shame of her exposure warred with relief at finding unexpected protection, while memories of her father's teachings about frontier survival reminded her that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford in her current circumstances. When Chayton pulled a wool blanket from his saddlebags and draped it around her shoulders with careful propriety, the warmth felt like a benediction from heaven itself. The fabric was soft and clean, smelling faintly of wood smoke and prairie grass, masculine scents that somehow managed to be both foreign and deeply comforting. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling the blanket close around her body, while studying the face of the man who had risked his life for her sake. Chayton's features were sharp and weathered, marked by sun and wind, but noble in a way that transcended racial boundaries or cultural differences. "We ride for Willow Springs," he said, helping her up behind his saddle with hands that were gentle, despite their obvious strength. "There's a school teacher there, Helen Victoria. She'll have proper clothes and can vouch for your character." The mention of Helen brought a flutter of hope to Nora's chest. She had met the school teacher just 2 nights ago at the way station, and the woman had been nothing but kind and generous. If anyone could provide sanctuary and support against the mine's fabricated charges, it would be someone with Helen's education and community standing. "What about you?" Nora asked, as she settled against Chayton's back, her arms encircling his waist with an intimacy that circumstances had forced upon them. "Won't the townspeople be suspicious of a Lakota warrior riding in with a settler woman?" A ghost of a smile crossed Chayton's weathered features as he patted the oilcloth bundle that contained his war bonnet. "That's why I carry this. The eagle feathers command respect during formal negotiations, though I only wear them when diplomatic protocol demands it. For fighting, a simple hair tie serves better." The war bonnet represented more than personal status. It was a diplomatic tool, a symbol of legitimate tribal authority that even corrupt frontier officials had to acknowledge under federal treaty obligations. Wars might be fought and promises broken, but certain ceremonial protocols still had to be observed when dealing with recognized Native American leaders. They rode hard across the rolling prairie, Dakota's hooves drumming a steady rhythm against sun-baked earth, while the vastness of the territory stretched endlessly in all directions. The landscape bore the scars of industrial exploitation more clearly than any government report could have documented dry creek beds, where water should have been running abandoned homesteads with broken windmills and the distant haze of smoke from mining operations that poisoned the air for miles around. "My uncle sold my land to pay gambling debts," Nora said suddenly, needing to share the burden that had brought her to this desperate place. The words came easier than she had expected, perhaps because Chayton's steady presence made confession feel like conversation rather than humiliation. "Edward Marcel." Chayton replied, surprising her with his knowledge of territorial affairs. "The mine has been collecting such debts all summer, using sheriff's badges to enforce contracts that wouldn't survive examination by honest courts." The casual familiarity with which he spoke about legal matters surprised Nora, challenging her assumptions about what a Lakota warrior might know about settler law and territorial politics. But then she realized survival in this environment demanded knowledge of one's enemy's methods regardless of race or cultural background. "Your people are facing similar pressures?" she asked, though the answer was obvious from the bitter edge in his voice when he spoke of the mine's activities. Our winter camp at Prairie Rose depends on the river that Dietrich dammed for his stamp mill. Chayton confirmed. Without water, we'll have to move deeper into the mountains before the snows come. Some of our elders won't survive another forced migration. The conversation revealed the scope of Dietrich's systematic assault on anyone who might resist his expansion plans. Whether they stole water from tribal lands or property from individual settlers, the mine's operations served the same ruthless logic: clear the territory of independent actors who might challenge corporate control over resources and political processes. As they approached Willow Springs, the town that spread before them looked superficially peaceful, false-fronted buildings lining a dusty Main Street side lanes that petered out into prairie after a few blocks, and the inevitable cluster of corrals and warehouses that marked it as a supply point for surrounding agricultural and mining operations. But even at a distance, signs of systematic intimidation were visible to eyes that knew what to look for. Too many businesses stood shuttered despite the afternoon hour when commerce should have been flourishing. Too few people moved along the boardwalks for a community of Willow Springs' size. The very air seemed to carry a sense of fear and resignation that spoke of a town under siege by forces beyond local control. "There's our problem," Chayton said grimly, pointing toward the outskirts where a freight wagon had been positioned to block the main road into town. Greasy Pete stood beside the obstruction, with Nora's stolen dress draped over his arm like a victory banner, his satisfied smirk promising trouble for anyone who challenged his version of recent events. The other guards who had escaped from the canyon flanked him with weapons ready, their positioning suggesting military training and considerable experience in controlling civilian populations. Word travels fast when you have men stationed along all the routes. Chayton observed reining Lakota to a halt just outside effective rifle range. They were expecting us. No. The trap was elegantly simple in its brutality control. On the narrative, before the targets could reach potential allies, establish the official version of events through repetition and authority, then eliminate any witnesses who might contradict the approved story. Pete and his companions had transformed a simple theft into something far more dangerous, a test of who truly controlled Willow Springs and who would be allowed to seek justice within its boundaries. "What's our move?" Nora asked quietly, her hand instinctively checking the weight of her father's Colt where it rode wrapped in oilcloth beneath the blanket. Chayton's response was to begin unwrapping his ceremonial war bonnet with deliberate formality, his movements carrying the weight of diplomatic ritual despite the urgency of their situation. When he settled the magnificent eagle feathers on his head, he was transformed from a simple scout into a figure of undeniable dignity and authority that transcended racial prejudice through sheer force of ceremonial presence. The effect on the assembled guards was immediate and unmistakable. Even Greasy Pete seemed to shrink back slightly as Chayton urged Lakota forward, his bearing radiating the kind of formal power that demanded respect regardless of personal prejudices or political allegiances. The confrontation that developed at the roadblock would be remembered in Willow Springs long after the principals were dead and buried, becoming the stuff of legend that parents would tell their children about. The day when justice and corruption met face to face on the dusty main street of their small community. "Hold up there." Greasy Pete called out as Chayton and Nora approached his voice, carrying forced joviality that fooled no one who understood the true nature of frontier authority. Chayton reined Lakota to a halt just outside the effective range of the guards' rifles, his position carefully chosen to allow for rapid escape if negotiations deteriorated into violence. His right hand rested casually near his Winchester stock, ready to draw and fire in one fluid motion if circumstances demanded immediate action. "What business?" he asked, his voice carrying the formal cadences of tribal oratory that lent weight to even simple questions. Pete swaggered forward with obvious pleasure in his moment of authority, flanked by Rusty Joe and the younger guard, whose mean temperament showed in every line of his scarred face. The stolen dress in Pete's hands had become evidence in a kangaroo court where guilt was predetermined and justice was whatever served Quicksilver Mine's immediate interests. "Well now," Pete drawled with exaggerated courtesy, "seems we got ourselves a theft situation here that requires official attention from territorial law enforcement." He gestured toward Nora with mock politeness, while his eyes gleamed with malice. "This young lady has been accused by Miss Helen Victoria of stealing valuable silver property, and we got a warrant right here from Sheriff Harry himself." The folded paper that Pete produced with a flourish might have been official, but Nora noticed that he didn't offer close examination. The accusation hit her like a physical blow. Helen Victoria had been nothing but kind during their brief meeting, giving her the brooch freely as thanks for helping with the ranch children's education. "That's impossible," Nora protested, finding her voice despite the shock. "Miss Victoria gave me that brooch as a gift. She would never accuse me of theft." "Oh, she would, and she did," Pete interrupted with satisfaction. "Even provided evidence to support her complaint." He held up Nora's stolen stockings, dangling them like a hangman's noose. "Found these hidden in your gear when we searched for the stolen property. Funny how thieves always try to hide their tracks, ain't it?" The logic was circular and obviously fabricated, but Nora could see how it would play to frighten townspeople who depended on the mine for employment and Sheriff Harry for protection. Her association with Chayton would only add to the suspicion, confirming every negative stereotype about settlers who consorted with hostile Indians. Chayton must have sensed her distress because his left hand moved to rest briefly on her knee, a gesture of reassurance that sent warmth through her chest despite their circumstances. When he spoke, his voice carried new authority that seemed to draw power from the ceremonial regalia he wore. "Was this woman is under my protection," he declared, the eagle feathers of his war bonnet catching afternoon sunlight as he surveyed the assembled guards. "If you have accusations to make, produce the brooch and a witness who will swear to the theft under oath." The challenge was formal and unmistakable, delivered with diplomatic precision that forced even corrupt officials to acknowledge legal niceties. Treaties might be broken and promises forgotten, but certain protocols still had to be observed when dealing with recognized tribal leaders who carried the authority of sovereign nations. Pete's response revealed the true nature of his authority, raising his rifle with practiced coordination that his companions immediately matched. He snarled with frustrated rage. "Don't need no witness when we got the evidence right here." He spat racial hatred, overcoming tactical caution. "And don't need no ceremony from a savage who's got no business interfering with decent folks' affairs." The moment balanced on a knife's edge as three rifles faced one with Nora caught helplessly in the crossfire. She could feel Chayton's muscles tensing as he calculated their chances and found them wanting his tactical mind, working through options that seemed to end in disaster. But sometimes salvation came from unexpected directions. Chayton's shot came without warning, a precise crack that shattered Pete's stirrup and sent his horse into a panicked rear. The Winchester's report echoed off the false-fronted buildings as chaos erupted in the dusty street guards, struggling to control their mounts while maintaining aim on targets that refused to stand still. "Hold tight," Chayton commanded, and urged Lakota forward through the gap that opened as Pete's horse bolted sideways into the freight wagon. Nora pressed herself against his back as they thundered past the scrambling guards, feeling rather than seeing Rusty Joe's rifle swing toward them. A second shot from Chayton's Winchester sent the rail-thin guard diving for cover behind a wagon wheel, his own weapon discharging harmlessly into the air. Behind them, Pete's voice rose in frustrated rage. "Get them! Don't let that savage and his whore reach town." But Chayton was already turning Lakota into the narrow alley between Morrison's general store and the blacksmith's shop, his knowledge of the town's layout guiding them away from main thoroughfares where pursuit would be easier. The paint horses' hooves drummed against packed earth as they raced through back streets that most residents never explored. Faces appeared in doorways and windows as they passed, expressions ranging from concern to fear to careful neutrality as people tried to understand what was happening. Some showed sympathy, others reflected racial prejudices, but most displayed the cautious neutrality of those who had learned that taking sides could prove fatal. "Are you hurt?" Chayton asked quietly, as they slowed to navigate a tight turn, his concern evident despite the need for speed. The question stirred something warm in Nora's chest, recognition that his care had moved beyond tactical necessity into something personal. "No," she replied, her voice steadier than expected. "But we need to reach Helen Victoria quickly. She's the only one who can prove I'm innocent." Chayton nodded grimly as he guided Lakota through the final turn that brought them to Maple Street and the schoolhouse that represented their best hope for sanctuary in a town where corruption had poisoned the foundations of law and order. The building that awaited them squatted at the street's end like a fortress of learning in a community that had precious little use for education beyond basic skills. Built of native stone with an empty bell tower, it served double duty as the town meeting hall when circumstances required gatherings too large for private homes. But even as they approached what should have been sanctuary, both could see armed figures moving through shadows around the building, positioning themselves with the precision of men who understood urban warfare and had experience controlling civilian populations through systematic intimidation. The trap was closing with inexorable efficiency, but they had committed themselves to a course that offered no retreat and no alternatives to victory or death. The schoolhouse door opened before they could dismount, revealing Helen Victoria with genuine alarm that immediately dispelled doubts about her complicity in the charges against Nora. The teacher appeared to be in her late 20s, with intelligent gray eyes and ink-stained fingers that spoke of long hours preparing lessons for students whose attendance depended more on agricultural needs than systematic education. But something was wrong with Helen's appearance that sent warning signals racing through Nora's mind. Faded bruises marked the teacher's left wrist, where sleeves didn't quite conceal them, and her movements carried the careful precision of someone nursing hidden injuries while trying to maintain normal appearances. "Dear heavens, child, what happened to you?" Helen asked, ushering them both inside, while her eyes darted nervously toward the windows facing the street. Without hesitation, she pulled off her own shawl and wrapped it around Nora's shoulders, adding another layer of warmth and modesty to Chayton's blanket. The gesture was automatic and generous, but Nora noticed how Helen winced slightly when she raised her arms, as if the movement caused pain she was trying to conceal. "The mine guard stole my clothes while I was bathing," Nora explained quickly, her words tumbling over each other in haste. "Then they accused me of stealing your brooch. They said you reported it missing." Helen's face went white, then flushed with apparent indignation. Moving to a small wooden box on her desk, she retrieved the silver butterfly brooch that had supposedly been stolen, handling it with careful reverence. "I never accused you of anything," Helen said firmly, pressing the brooch into Nora's palm with trembling fingers. "I gave this to you freely, as thanks for helping me teach those ranch children their letters. You have such a gift for making learning seem like play." Relief flooded through Nora's chest like warm honey. Helen's support meant everything without it, and she would have no defense against the mine's fabricated charges and no credibility in a community where her reputation was already under assault. "Then you'll tell Sheriff Harry that I'm innocent?" Nora asked hopefully, though something in Helen's expression suggested complications. Helen's response confirmed her fears. The teacher's face darkened as she glanced nervously toward the windows, where shadows moved with purpose, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I would if I could, but it's not that simple." Helen said, her words carrying the weight of someone trapped between competing loyalties and impossible choices. "Harry threatened to close the school permanently if I spoke against his men's official reports. He said the territory couldn't afford to support teachers who made false accusations against law enforcement." But there was something more, something Helen wasn't saying that showed in the way her hand moved instinctively to cover those faded bruises on her wrist. Before anyone could press for details, heavy footsteps on the front porch announced unwelcome visitors who had no intention of observing social niceties. "Miss Victoria," Greasy Pete's voice, carried clearly through the walls, raised in mock authority that carried undertones of genuine menace. "We know you got them fugitives in there. Send out the thief and the savage, and maybe nobody gets hurt today." The threat was barely veiled, and Helen's terrified response suggested she understood exactly what Pete and his companions were capable of when their authority was challenged. Her face went pale, but she moved with surprising decisiveness to guide them toward the schoolhouse's rear exit. "There's a back door through the supply closet," she whispered urgently. "It opens onto the alley behind Dr. Malcolm's surgery. If you can reach him." But Chayton was already moving with the fluid efficiency that had kept him alive through countless dangerous encounters. Yanking Nora behind the large slate board that dominated one wall of the classroom, he motioned Helen down behind her desk, while his Winchester appeared in his hands as if conjured from thin air. The front door exploded inward, under the impact of rifle butts and heavy boots sending splinters flying across the wooden floor, as Pete swaggered into the room with Rusty Joe and the younger guard flanking him in a display of overwhelming force designed to intimidate rather than simply apprehend. "Now where might our fugitives be hiding?" Pete mused aloud, his voice dripping with false courtesy as his eyes swept the confined space. "Behind that big slate board, maybe, or under the teacher's pretty little desk." The rifle shot that followed shattered more than just the morning quiet. It shattered any pretense that this was legitimate law enforcement, rather than an execution disguised as an arrest. The bullet punched through the slate board just inches from Chayton's head, sending fragments cascading down on Nora as she pressed herself against the wall. Chayton's return shot was immediate and devastating, the Winchester's crack echoing through the confined space like thunder, while Rusty Joe screamed in pain and surprise. The bullet had found its mark in the guard's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the floor in a spray of blood that painted abstract patterns on the schoolroom's wooden planks. "Back door now," Chayton commanded, grabbing Nora's hand and pulling her toward the rear exit, while Helen scrambled after them with surprising agility for someone who had seemed so fragile moments before. They burst through the door into brilliant morning sunlight that felt like a benediction after the confined terror of the classroom. But the narrow alley between the schoolhouse and Dr. Malcolm's surgery offered only temporary sanctuary. More guards were already moving to surround the area, their coordination suggesting military training and considerable experience in urban warfare. A window shattered behind them as Pete and his remaining companion fired through the glass, their shots going wide in their haste, but close enough to send stone chips flying from the building walls around their heads. "You're bleeding," Nora said, noticing a thin line of crimson across Chayton's left cheekbone, where a slate fragment had found its mark. "It's nothing," he replied automatically, but her hand was already moving to examine the wound with gentle competence. The moment of connection lasted only seconds, but it carried weight that went far beyond simple medical attention. In that narrow space with gunshots echoing around them and their enemies closing in from multiple directions, Nora found herself looking past the war paint and ceremonial regalia to the man beneath. Chayton met her gaze steadily, and for an instant, his usual stoic mask slipped to reveal something vulnerable and almost surprised, as if he hadn't expected to find himself caring so deeply about a settler woman's welfare. Dr. Malcolm's appearance at his surgery's back door broke the spell, but provided the sanctuary they desperately needed. The physician took in their situation with a single glance and ushered them inside without questions or hesitation. His medical training extending to include emergency situations that had nothing to do with disease or conventional injury. Dr. Edwin Malcolm's surgery smelled of carbolic acid and determination. The clean scents of professional medicine warring with the acrid smoke that drifted through the windows from Pete's increasingly desperate attempts to flush out his quarry. The physician was perhaps 40 years old, with the steady hands and unflappable demeanor that frontier medicine demanded, but his expression showed growing concern as he absorbed the full implications of the violence erupting in his previously peaceful community. "What's really happening here, Doc?" Chayton asked quietly as they pressed into the cramped space between examining table and instrument cabinet, his Winchester held ready, but pointed safely toward the floor. Malcolm finished washing his hands with methodical precision, using the routine task as cover, while he observed the street outside for signs of their pursuers. When he turned to address their question, his face carried the grim expression of someone who had been watching disaster approach for months without finding ways to prevent it. "Conrad Dietrich has been systematically buying up water rights and mineral claims throughout the territory." Malcolm explained, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated frustration. "He uses Sheriff Harry's badges to enforce contracts that wouldn't survive examination by any honest court, and eliminates anyone who asks too many questions about his methods." The scope of the conspiracy was larger than either Nora or Chayton had imagined. This wasn't simply about individual theft or isolated corruption. It was about transforming the entire region into a corporate territory, where Dietrich's word would be law and resistance would be crushed with systematic brutality. Helen Victoria moved to the window, peering carefully through the curtains toward the street, where armed figures continued to position themselves with ominous purpose. Her movements remained careful and controlled, but Nora noticed how she favored her left side, as if nursing injuries that were more extensive than the visible bruises on her wrist. "There's something else?" Helen said softly, her voice carrying information that would prove crucial to understanding the true dimensions of their predicament. "Something about why I've been so frightened, why I couldn't speak freely before now." The revelation that followed would change everything about their understanding of Helen's situation and the forces that controlled Willow Springs. 2 weeks ago, Helen had been contacted by someone claiming to represent federal authorities investigating territorial corruption. She had been asked to send coded telegrams documenting specific instances of mine activities, sheriff's department cooperation, and community intimidation. "I've been gathering evidence." Helen whispered, tears streaming down her face as she spoke words that had been burning in her chest for days. "Timothy Walsh and I have been sending coded reports to the Territorial Marshal's office. But someone's been intercepting our communications, editing them before they reach federal authorities." But there was more, something that explained the bruises and her obvious fear. "My husband, Robert, isn't dead," she continued, her voice breaking. "The mine collapse 3 months ago was staged. Dietrich's men are holding him prisoner in the lower tunnels, using him to forge engineering reports and safety documents. They told me cooperation was the only way to keep him alive." The truth struck Nora and Chayton simultaneously. Helen's apparent nervousness hadn't been simple fear, but the desperate behavior of someone trying to serve multiple masters while keeping her husband alive and gathering evidence that might eventually be used against his captors. Before anyone could respond to this revelation, Timothy Walsh burst through the surgery's front door with blood streaming from a cut on his forehead and excitement blazing in his normally mild eyes. Dr. Malcolm's young assistant had always been quiet and unassuming. But something had transformed him into a bearer of crucial news. The federal marshals got our last telegram. Timothy gasped, pointing back toward the telegraph office where smoke was beginning to rise from what appeared to be a deliberate fire. They're already positioned outside town, waiting for Dietrich to incriminate himself completely before they move in. The reply from the U.S. Marshal's office came back curt and stamped wire received men en route hold until federal lines are crossed. The news should have been encouraging, but Timothy's expression suggested complications that would make their situation more, rather than less dangerous. But someone burned the telegraph office to cut off our communications. We're on our own until the marshals decide they have enough evidence to act. Helen's revelation about the surviving husband provided the missing piece of the conspiracy puzzle. Robert tried to expose safety violations in the mine tunnels, she said quietly. When Dietrich learned about his plans to contact federal inspectors, they staged the collapse and have been using his engineering expertise to create fraudulent documents ever since. The web of corruption and betrayal was more extensive than anyone had imagined, reaching into the most trusted institutions of their community and poisoning relationships that had seemed beyond suspicion. But even as they absorbed these revelations, the immediate tactical situation remained desperate, beyond hope of simple resolution. Dr. Malcolm moved to his medical cabinet and began assembling supplies with the efficient movements of someone preparing for emergency surgery. "If we're going to survive until federal help arrives," he said grimly, "we need to reach the stone church. It's the only building in town that won't burn, and the bell tower will give us visibility over the entire area." The suggestion made tactical sense, but Helen's response revealed additional complications they hadn't anticipated. "Dietrich's men have been using the church as a staging area," she said urgently. "They've been storing supplies there, and I think they're planning to make it look like we took hostages when the federal marshals finally arrive." Timothy nodded confirmation of Helen's fears. "I've seen wagons moving equipment there for the past week. Whatever Dietrich's planning, the church is central to his strategy." But even as they discussed their limited options, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced new arrivals that would complicate their situation beyond any hope of simple resolution. Through the surgery windows, they could see more mine guards taking positions throughout the town, and their coordination suggesting that Dietrich had finally decided to abandon any pretense of legitimate law enforcement in favor of open warfare against federal authority. "They're surrounding the entire business district," Malcolm observed grimly as he watched armed men position themselves with military precision. "Anyone who tries to leave town will be shot as a fleeing criminal." The systematic nature of the operation suggested careful planning and considerable resources. This wasn't simply about eliminating individual witnesses. Dietrich was implementing a comprehensive plan to control the entire community while creating a narrative that would justify whatever violence followed. "How many federal marshals are waiting outside town?" Chayton asked his tactical mind, working through the implications of their isolation. Timothy's answer was both encouraging and terrifying. "3 that I know of, maybe more. But they're under orders not to intervene until they have clear evidence of federal crimes being committed. Our coded telegrams documented corruption and intimidation, but Dietrich's been careful not to cross lines that would trigger immediate federal intervention." The revelation explained why their enemies felt confident enough to escalate their tactics so dramatically. They were gambling that federal authorities would hesitate to intervene in what appeared to be local law enforcement activities, giving Dietrich time to eliminate witnesses and create a version of events that would survive federal investigation. "There's one more thing," Helen said softly, her voice carrying information that would transform their understanding of who could be trusted and who was secretly working against them. The church has hidden passages built into the stone walls. When the original settlers constructed it, they included storage spaces and emergency routes, and the families who built it came from areas where such precautions had proven necessary during earlier conflicts. The information about the church's architecture provided crucial intelligence about tactical possibilities that none of them had considered. Instead of frontal assault against fortified positions, they might be able to use the building's own design to outflank Dietrich's forces and potentially rescue any hostages who were being held there. But as they prepared to implement Helen's knowledge of the church's hidden features, disaster struck with the sudden violence that characterized frontier warfare. The sound of splintering wood announced that Pete and his remaining men had finally breached the surgery's defenses, their patience with siege tactics exhausted by the need to produce results before federal intervention became inevitable. "Time's up, Doc." Dory Pete's voice carried clearly through the building as smoke began seeping under the doors from fires that were being set systematically throughout the business district. "Send out them fugitives or burn with them when this whole block goes up in flames." The ultimatum was designed to force exactly the kind of desperate action that would serve Dietrich's larger strategy of eliminating witnesses while creating justification for whatever violence followed. But it also revealed the scope of destruction that corporate interests were willing to inflict on an entire community to protect their illegal operations from federal investigation. The flames that consumed Willow Springs Business District painted the night sky orange and red, casting dancing shadows through the surgery windows, while the acrid smell of burning wood mixed with more sinister odors that suggested systematic arson rather than accidental fire. Through the chaos of shouting voices and running feet, one sound rose above all others, the deep, resonant toll of the church bell, calling the community to emergency assembly. "The stone church," Dr. Malcolm said urgently, his earlier composure cracking under the pressure of immediate disaster. "It's the only building in town that won't burn. If we're going to make a stand, that's where we need to be." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that their sanctuary would be a house of worship, but frontier pragmatism outweighed philosophical considerations when survival was at stake. Stone walls would provide protection from rifle fire, while the church's elevated position would offer tactical advantages if the confrontation escalated into open warfare. But as they prepared to move through the smoke-filled streets toward their only hope of safety, Helen Victoria's revelation about the true scope of their enemy's plans took a turn that none of them had anticipated. What she had learned during her weeks of forced cooperation would expose the real mastermind behind the systematic destruction of their community. "It's not just Dietrich," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of approaching flames. "There's someone else coordinating everything, someone who's been planning this operation for months to eliminate federal investigation before it can reach territorial authorities." The accusation that followed would shatter their understanding of territorial politics and reveal the true scope of the conspiracy. They were fighting against corporate interests that reached far beyond local mining operations. "Sheriff Harry isn't just Dietrich's subordinate." Helen continued, her words coming in a rush as she finally revealed information she had been forced to conceal. "He's been playing multiple sides from the beginning, taking money from Quicksilver, while secretly negotiating with competing mining companies, federal investigators, and territorial politicians who want this entire region cleared of independent settlers and tribal communities." The revelation explained Harry's specific knowledge of federal investigation procedures and his confidence in being able to control whatever narrative emerged from the night's violence. The sheriff hadn't simply been a corrupt local official. He had been running a complex operation designed to profit from territorial chaos, while positioning himself as indispensable to whatever corporate interests ultimately gained control. The federal marshals who were supposed to be waiting outside town Helen added with growing desperation in her voice. Harry's been feeding them false information about tribal uprisings and settler violence to justify military intervention that would clear the territory for whoever pays him the most. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. As they made their way through smoke-filled streets toward the stone church that promised sanctuary, Helen's voice carried information that would transform their understanding of who could be trusted and who was secretly working to destroy them. Dr. Malcolm has been reporting our activities to Harry for weeks. She whispered her words barely audible over the sound of crackling flames and distant gunfire. Every plan we've made, every person we've tried to organize, Malcolm's been feeding information to the sheriff's office while pretending to support resistance efforts. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the burning buildings around them, poisoning relationships and destroying trust that had seemed unshakable just moments before. Dr. Malcolm's face went white, then flushed red, as he realized that his carefully constructed deception was finally being exposed to the light of desperate circumstances. "She's lying," Malcolm protested, but his voice carried the hollow ring of desperation rather than honest outrage. "Helen's been coerced into making false accusations. Can't you see that her husband's captivity has made her willing to say anything that might save his life?" But Timothy Walsh, the mild-mannered medical assistant who had seemed incapable of violence or deception, suddenly produced evidence that would prove devastating to Malcolm's denials. From inside his coat, he pulled a leather portfolio containing correspondence that bore both Dietrich's personal seal and Malcolm's distinctive handwriting. "I've been copying everything," Timothy said clearly, his voice steady despite his obvious emotional turmoil. Payment schedules for information about patient conversations that revealed opposition to mining operations. Lists of families planning to leave the territory rather than submit to company control. Reports on community meetings and resistance activities. Dr. Malcolm has been selling information about his own patients to fund gambling debts that made him vulnerable to corporate blackmail. The revelations kept coming like hammer blows against already shattered trust. Malcolm hadn't simply been reporting on resistance activities, he had been systematically betraying the medical confidentiality that made frontier healthcare possible, turning private conversations about community problems into intelligence reports for corporate enforcers. Tonight's gathering at the church was his suggestion. Timothy continued relentlessly. He recommended using medical emergency as a pretext, specifically, so Dietrich's forces would know exactly when and where to find everyone involved in organizing opposition to mining operations. Helen's tears flowed freely now, but her voice remained steady as she faced the man whose betrayal had cost so many lives and caused immeasurable suffering. When Robert tried to expose the safety violations in the mine tunnels, Malcolm told Dietrich about my husband's plans to contact federal inspectors. That's why they staged the collapse and why they're keeping him prisoner instead of killing him outright. The web of corruption and betrayal was more extensive than anyone had imagined, reaching into the most trusted institutions of their community and poisoning relationships that had seemed beyond suspicion. But even as these revelations transformed their understanding of who could be trusted, the immediate tactical situation remained desperate beyond hope of simple resolution. As they reached the church steps, the full scope of the trap that had been set for them became clear. The building was already occupied by dozens of townspeople who had fled the fires, but it also contained armed guards who had been positioned there in anticipation of exactly this kind of emergency gathering. Conrad Dietrich himself stood at the altar, no longer bothering to conceal his direct involvement in the night's violence. Beside him, a figure in chains confirmed Helen's most desperate fears. Robert Victoria was indeed alive. But his condition spoke to months of imprisonment and forced labor that had taken a terrible toll on both his physical health and his spirit. "Welcome to the final act," Dietrich announced with theatrical flourish as more townspeople crowded into the church, seeking safety from the flames that continued to spread through the business district. Tonight we settle all accounts and establish once and for all who truly controls this territory and its resources. The mine owner had transformed the church into a stage for his ultimate demonstration of power using hostages and fire to force the entire community to witness his triumph over anyone who had dared to resist corporate authority. But he had also made a crucial mistake. By gathering all the principals in one location, he had created an opportunity for coordinated resistance that might not have existed if his enemies had remained scattered throughout the town. But even as Chayton began organizing the frightened civilians into something resembling a coherent force capable of collective action, Dietrich was implementing the final phase of his plan to eliminate resistance throughout the region. The church's stone walls that promised protection would become a trap if his forces could control all the exits and prevent anyone from escaping to carry tales of company rule by the gun to federal authorities. "You have 1 hour to decide," Dietrich announced with cold satisfaction, his voice carrying clearly over the sounds of fear and confusion that filled the sanctuary. "Surrender the troublemakers who have been stirring up resistance to legitimate mining operations, or face the consequences when this building becomes their funeral pyre." The ultimatum was designed to force the community to turn against Nora and Chayton, sacrificing them to save the majority. But Dietrich had underestimated the impact that their courage and partnership would have on people who had spent months living in fear of exactly this kind of corporate violence and systematic intimidation. The race through Willow Springs' burning streets toward the stone church became a desperate test of endurance and nerve, as Chayton carried Nora through smoke and flame, while Timothy Walsh and Helen Victoria fought their way through chaos that had consumed their community. Behind them, the systematic destruction of the business district continued with military precision, each building igniting in sequence, as Dietrich's arsonists worked to drive every survivor toward the trap that awaited at their supposed sanctuary. Nora's ankle, injured during their earlier escape, had worsened during the night's violence, until walking became impossible and running was out of the question. But Chayton's strength seemed inexhaustible as he bore her weight through the maze of burning buildings and smoke-filled alleys, his protective instincts overriding tactical considerations that might have demanded he abandon the wounded to save those who could still move under their own power. The church is surrounded. Helen gasped as they paused in the shadow of Morrison's general store. Flames already licking at its false front, while armed figures moved through the smoke with obvious purpose. Dietrich's men have it completely cut off. Through the hellish orange glow that had transformed their peaceful town into something resembling the aftermath of warfare, they could see guards positioned at every approach to the stone building that represented their only hope of safety. The trap was perfect in its simplicity: drive the survivors toward sanctuary, then control them completely once they were gathered in a single location. But as they watched from concealment, Timothy Walsh revealed crucial information that would change their tactical calculations entirely. During his weeks of secretly gathering evidence for federal authorities, he had discovered something about the church's construction that none of them had previously known. "There's a supply of mining explosives hidden in the blacksmith's shop," Timothy said urgently, pointing toward a building that was already beginning to smoke as flames approached from multiple directions. "Dietrich's been stockpiling blasting powder and fuses there for weeks, probably planning to destroy evidence if federal investigators got too close." The revelation transformed their understanding of available resources. Instead of facing Dietrich's superior numbers with nothing but small arms, they might be able to create diversions and tactical advantages through careful use of industrial explosives that the mine owner had inadvertently provided. "I can get to the blacksmith shop through the alley behind the bank." Timothy continued, his mild demeanor replaced by the focused determination of someone who had found unexpected courage in the face of community crisis. "If I can retrieve enough blasting powder, we might be able to create new entry points in the church walls." The plan that formed among them was desperate, but not entirely hopeless. Using Timothy's knowledge of Dietrich's weapons cache and Helen's information about the church's hidden passages, they could create multiple simultaneous attacks that would divide their enemy's attention and prevent Dietrich from maintaining complete control over both his hostages and his defensive perimeter. But as they prepared to implement their coordinated assault disaster, struck with the sudden violence that characterized frontier warfare, Little Wolf, the youngest member of Chayton's band, who had been captured and rescued earlier, appeared in the smoke-filled street with blood streaming from a fresh wound in his shoulder. The boy had been shot while trying to help other tribal members escape from guards who were systematically rounding up anyone who might serve as a hostage or scapegoat for the night's violence. "Sister Winona sent me." Little Wolf gasped in Lakota, then switched to English for the benefit of others who needed to understand the tactical situation. The warriors are moving to surround the church from the prairie side, but they need to know which building sections are safe to approach. The arrival of Lakota reinforcements shifted the balance of power, but it also raised stakes beyond individual survival, to include questions about racial warfare and federal military intervention that could have consequences throughout the territories. Dietrich's plan to eliminate resistance had evolved into something that might justify calling in cavalry troops to pacify the entire region. "There's another way into the church," Nora said suddenly, her knowledge of the building's architecture providing crucial intelligence about options that none of the others had considered. When the original families built it, they included storage chambers in the foundation and connecting passages to the bell tower. I helped clean those spaces when I taught Sunday school to ranch children. The information transformed their understanding of tactical possibilities. Instead of frontal assault against fortified positions, they could use the church's own design to outflank Dietrich's forces and potentially rescue the hostages who were trapped inside with him. But the tactical situation became desperate. When Little Wolf collapsed from blood loss, his shoulder wound more serious than any of them had initially realized. The bullet had shattered bone and severed blood vessels, creating an injury that would be fatal without immediate medical attention from someone with surgical experience. "I have to get him to safety," Winona said desperately, appearing from the smoke like a spirit of vengeance, with war paint streaking her face and her rifle held ready for combat. Her maternal instincts warred with tactical necessity as she cradled the injured child. "Not through this," Chayton replied grimly, gesturing toward the hellish scene of fire and gunplay that surrounded their position. The tactical situation had become impossible. They couldn't advance while carrying wounded companions, but they couldn't retreat without abandoning the hostages who were trapped in the church with Dietrich and his remaining forces. The mine owner had succeeded in creating exactly the kind of no-win scenario that would justify whatever violence he chose to employ against civilian populations. That was when Timothy Walsh provided the solution that would break the deadlock and transform their desperate defense into coordinated offensive action. The young man had been carrying more than just intelligence about Dietrich's weapons cache. He had actually retrieved several small charges of blasting powder and fuses during his reconnaissance of the blacksmith's shop. The church foundation. Timothy explained quickly as he distributed the mining explosives among the group. "If we can create controlled explosions in the right locations, we can open new entry points while eliminating some of Dietrich's defensive positions." The explosives were genuine mining equipment, black powder charges with slow-burning fuses that were normally used for excavation and ore extraction. In the hands of people desperate enough to use them creatively, they could serve purposes that their manufacturers had never intended. The plan that formed among them required perfect timing and considerable luck qualities that frontier warfare rarely provided in adequate measure. Using Nora's knowledge of hidden passages, Timothy's explosives, and Winona's warriors positioned outside the building, they could create chaos that might allow them to rescue hostages while eliminating Dietrich's ability to control the situation. But success would also require someone to remain behind, with Little Wolf providing medical care that might keep him alive until proper help could arrive. Dr. Malcolm's betrayal had been exposed, but his medical skills were still needed to save an innocent child's life. "I'll stay with the boy," Malcolm said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone seeking redemption through service rather than words. "Whatever I've done wrong, I won't let a child die for my mistakes." As they prepared to implement their coordinated assault, each member of their small force understood that survival depended on courage, competence, and the kind of mutual trust that had been forged through shared trials and common purpose. The final battle for Willow Springs was about to begin, and its outcome would determine whether company men's tyranny or community resistance would shape the future of territorial development throughout the American West. The stone church of Willow Springs had been built to withstand harsh weather and occasional raids that characterized frontier life, but its architect had never envisioned it serving as a fortress in a battle between company men's tyranny and community resistance. As midnight approached with the business district still burning around them, the building had become the focal point for a confrontation that would determine the future of territorial development throughout the American West. Inside the sanctuary, Conrad Dietrich commanded his final stronghold with the desperate authority of a man whose carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. Hostages filled the wooden pews townspeople who had fled the fires only to find themselves trapped with their tormentor, their faces reflecting the fear and resignation of people who had watched their community systematically destroyed by corporate violence. At the altar, Robert Victoria sat chained to the communion rail, his engineering expertise having been perverted into service for the very forces that had imprisoned him. Months of captivity had taken their toll, but his eyes still blazed with the intellectual fire that had made him dangerous to Dietrich's illegal operations. Nearby, several Lakota children sat bound with rope, their presence serving as insurance against rescue attempts by tribal warriors who were known to be moving through the darkness outside. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dietrich announced with theatrical flourish, his voice echoing off stone walls that had witnessed countless sermons about justice and redemption. "Tonight, you have the privilege of witnessing history. When federal investigators arrive tomorrow, they will find evidence of a savage uprising that required decisive action to protect civilized society. The mine owner's plan was brutally simple in its cynicism. The burned town would be blamed on Lakota raiders, while any survivors who might contradict that narrative would be eliminated as casualties of the raid itself. Federal troops would be called in to pacify the entire region, clearing it of both tribal bands and independent settlers who might resist future corporate expansion. Sheriff Harry, despite his earlier capture by Rusty Joe, had managed to negotiate his way back into Dietrich's good graces by providing crucial intelligence about federal marshal positions and communication procedures. Territories got no choice but to call in cavalry when savages start burning towns and taking hostages. He said with the defeated monotone of a man who had sold his integrity so completely that resistance was no longer possible. But even as Dietrich savored his moment of triumph, the forces gathering outside the church were implementing a coordinated assault that would test every assumption he had made about frontier warfare and community resistance. Nora's knowledge of the building's hidden passages had provided the tactical intelligence needed to turn architectural features into military advantages. The first explosion came from beneath the church foundation. Timothy Walsh's mining charges, collapsing part of the storage cellar and creating a breach in the stone walls that Dietrich's guards had thought impregnable. The blast sent shockwaves through the building while debris showered down on hostages and captors alike, transforming the sanctuary from a place of worship into a battlefield, where survival depended on quick reflexes and quicker thinking. Chayton came through the breach like an avenging spirit, his Winchester speaking with deadly authority as he cleared the improvised entry point of guards who had been caught off balance by the unexpected assault. Behind him, Winona and her warriors flowed into the church with the fluid coordination of fighters who had learned to trust each other's competence through years of warfare against overwhelming odds. But the real surprise came when Nora herself appeared in the bell tower above, having used the hidden passages that connected the Foundation storage areas to the upper levels of the building. Her father's Colt barked repeatedly as she provided covering fire for the assault teams below her marksmanship, proving that desperation could transform ordinary citizens into formidable combatants. "The federal marshals are already here," Nora called down to the assembled hostages, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos of battle raging around them. "They're positioned outside town waiting for enough evidence to justify intervention. Every crime you commit tonight is being documented for federal prosecution." The revelation struck Dietrich like a physical blow, his face going white as he realized that his carefully planned escape routes had been anticipated and blocked by authorities who possessed far more intelligence about his operations than he had suspected. Timothy and Helen's coded telegrams had reached their intended recipients despite Malcolm's attempts to intercept and edit them. "You think federal badges can protect you from corporate justice?" Dietrich snarled, drawing his own weapon, as the tactical situation deteriorated beyond any hope of controlled resolution. "This territory belongs to whoever has the strength to take it and hold it." What followed was the kind of close-quarters battle that frontier churches had never been designed to accommodate. Wooden pews became cover for combatants who fired at point-blank range, while terrified civilians crawled toward whatever safety they could find among overturned furniture and scattered hymnals. Robert Victoria, despite months of imprisonment and forced labor, managed to break his chains during the initial confusion and began helping hostages escape through the breaches that Timothy's explosives had created in the stone walls. His engineering knowledge proved invaluable in directing people toward structural weak points that could be enlarged to provide additional escape routes. The battle's turning point came when Sheriff Harry cornered between Dietrich's corporate forces and the community members he had betrayed for so long, made a final desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his corruption. Drawing his service revolver, he aimed not at the attackers, but at Dietrich himself perhaps, hoping that eliminating his chief co-conspirator might earn him mercy from federal authorities. "You promised federal protection," Harry screamed at Dietrich above the gunfire and confusion. "You said Washington would never interfere with legitimate territorial development." But Dietrich was beyond caring about subordinates' complaints or federal consequences. Producing a larger charge of mining explosive from his coat, a final insurance policy against capture and prosecution, he prepared to bring down the entire church rather than accept defeat at the hands of settlers and Indians he considered racially and economically inferior. "If I can't control this territory," Dietrich screamed above the gunfire and screaming, "then nobody will." The confrontation that followed would be remembered in territorial folklore as the moment when different peoples chose cooperation over racial hatred and justice over corporate submission. Chayton and Nora moved toward Dietrich from different directions, their coordination speaking to partnership that had transcended cultural boundaries through shared trials and mutual respect. Sheriff Harry, in a final moment of unexpected redemption, threw himself between Dietrich and the explosive device, his sacrifice preventing the mine owner from completing his plan to destroy the church and everyone in it. The corrupt lawman's death served as partial atonement for months of betrayal and collaboration with forces that had poisoned his community's foundations. But Dietrich himself proved harder to kill than his schemes had been to expose. Wounded but still dangerous, he fought with the desperate fury of a man who understood that capture meant hanging under federal jurisdiction. His final stand took place among the burning pews where he had planned to stage his fictional Indian massacre. The flames from overturned oil lamps providing a hellish backdrop for justice, finally confronting company men's tyranny. Timothy Walsh, the mild-mannered medical assistant, who had found unexpected courage in the face of community crisis, proved to be the instrument of final justice. When Dietrich made one last attempt to reach the church's main entrance with his explosive device, Timothy's rifle spoke with the authority of someone who had learned that sometimes violence was the only language that company rule by the gun understood. The mine owner's death came not in the grand confrontation he had orchestrated, but in the practical justice of a young man protecting his community from someone who had threatened everything decent people had worked to build in the wilderness. Conrad Dietrich fell among the debris of his own, making his corporate empire, dying with him. In the flames he had lit to destroy anyone who dared resist his vision of territorial development. As the immediate fighting subsided, the work of rescue and recovery began in earnest. Federal marshals emerged from their concealment outside town, and their presence confirming that Washington had indeed been monitoring the situation with far more attention than local criminals had realized. The evidence that Nora and Chayton had gathered at such terrible risk would be supplemented by testimony from dozens of witnesses who had survived the night's violence. But perhaps most importantly, the Willow Springs Compact, the agreement between settler and tribal communities that had emerged from necessity, would be formalized as a model for territorial development that served all citizens regardless of race or previous condition. The partnership between Nora and Chayton had proven that different peoples could work together when they faced common enemies and shared common goals. Dr. Malcolm, his betrayal finally exposed, but his medical skills still desperately needed, worked alongside Winona to treat Little Wolf's injuries and tend to other casualties from both sides of the conflict. His cooperation with federal authorities would determine whether he faced hanging for his role in the conspiracy or prison sentences that might eventually allow for redemption through service. Helen Victoria reunited with her husband after months of forced separation and coerced betrayal, began the difficult process of rebuilding trust within a community that had been torn apart by deception and violence. Her experience would provide valuable insights for preventing similar manipulation in other settlements, where corporate interests sought to exploit family loyalties and personal vulnerabilities. Robert Victoria's engineering expertise, no longer perverted into service for corporate criminals, would be crucial in rebuilding Willow Springs, according to principles of proper stewardship of water and timber, and neighbors keeping faith rather than pure profit maximization. The water rights that Dietrich had illegally claimed would be restored to their rightful owners, allowing both settler and tribal communities to thrive. As dawn broke over Willow Springs, the stone church still stood despite the violence it had witnessed, its walls scarred but intact, while smoke from the burned business district drifted across the prairie like incense from a funeral pyre. The hostages had been freed, the conspirators were dead or captured, and the community had learned that cooperation could triumph over the forces that sought to divide and exploit them. The federal investigation that followed would expose similar corruption throughout the territorial system, leading to legal reforms that protected individual rights against corporate exploitation for decades to come. But the real victory was measured in human terms. Families reunited, communities healed, and partnerships forged across racial and cultural boundaries that had once seemed impossible to bridge. Timothy Walsh, whose courage and intelligence gathering had proved crucial to exposing Dietrich's conspiracy, emerged as a natural leader, whose transformation from quiet medical assistant to community defender would inspire similar courage in other ordinary citizens facing extraordinary circumstances. His appointment as Willow Springs' new sheriff would mark the beginning of a new era in territorial law enforcement based on service to community rather than corporate interests. 6 weeks after the night that transformed Willow Springs from a company town into a genuine community, the territorial courthouse buzzed with activity as Circuit Judge Morrison conducted what would become known as the most comprehensive corruption trial in frontier legal history. The courtroom overflowed with spectators who had traveled from settlements throughout the region to witness justice finally being served against forces that had terrorized them for too long. Nora sat in the front row beside Chayton, her ankle fully healed and her reputation restored through testimony from dozens of witnesses who had seen her courage during the final confrontation with Dietrich's forces. The formal dress she wore, dark blue wool that Helen Victoria had helped her select from the territorial catalog, marked her transformation from desperate fugitive to respected citizen, whose testimony would help determine the fate of surviving conspirators. The evidence they had gathered at such terrible risk now filled an entire wall of the courtroom, organized with legal precision by federal prosecutors who had arrived from the territorial capital, with broad authority to investigate and prosecute corruption throughout the mining regions. Conrad Dietrich and Sheriff Harry were beyond earthly justice, but their surviving associates faced charges that could result in decades of imprisonment for their roles in systematic fraud, environmental destruction, and multiple murders. The case against the Quicksilver Mine conspiracy, a Morshaltstrau Judge Morrison intoned from his bench, represents one of the most comprehensive examples of corporate criminality that this territory has ever witnessed. The systematic bribery of officials, the forged documents, the intimidation and murder of citizens who dared to resist these crimes strike at the very foundations that make civilized society possible on the frontier. Helen Victoria took the witness stand with quiet dignity that reflected her journey from unwilling collaborator to courageous advocate for community justice. Her voice remained steady as she described the months of coercion that had forced her cooperation with Dietrich's organization, and the threats against her husband's life that had made resistance seem impossible until the final confrontation revealed alternatives to submission. I never stopped believing that what they were doing was wrong. Helen testified clearly, her eyes meeting those of community members who had felt betrayed by her forced cooperation. But they had Robert, and they convinced me that compliance was the only way to keep him alive. I was weak when I should have been strong, but I tried to document their crimes even while providing the information they demanded. Judge Morrison's response reflected the complex realities of frontier justice, where circumstances often force decent people into impossible choices between competing loyalties. Miss Victoria, this court recognizes that coercion can make victims of those who appear to be collaborators. Your ultimate cooperation with federal investigators has been invaluable, and this court will recommend clemency in recognition of your service to justice. Dr. Malcolm's testimony provided medical evidence documenting the environmental destruction caused by the mine's illegal operations, but his own role as an informant for corporate interests cast shadow over his professional credibility. His careful records showed increased rates of illness and death directly attributable to water contamination, while his betrayal of patient confidentiality had violated the fundamental ethics of frontier medicine. I let gambling debts compromise my judgment. Malcolm admitted under oath, his voice carrying the weight of professional shame and personal regret. Dietrich's organization exploited my weakness. But that doesn't excuse the harm I caused to people who trusted me with their health and their secrets. When Chayton took the stand, wearing his ceremonial war bonnet with quiet dignity, his testimony carried the weight of tribal authority and personal witness to crimes that had targeted his people with particular brutality. His formal education allowed him to speak directly to the court without interpreters lending additional credibility to his account of systematic persecution and environmental destruction. The Quicksilver Mine's crimes were not limited to individual theft or isolated violence. Chayton testified with the measured cadence of tribal oratory. They attempted to destroy entire ways of life, to eliminate communities that had existed on this land for generations beyond memory. Their ultimate goal was not simply profit, but the complete elimination of anyone who might resist corporate control over territorial resources. Nora's own testimony focused on the personal dimensions of the conspiracy, how individual citizens had been targeted for destruction when they attempted to assert legal rights or resist corporate intimidation through legitimate channels. Her account of events beginning with theft and escalating to attempted murder painted a clear picture of how systematic corruption operated at the ground level. "They didn't just steal my clothes or my property," Nora said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. "They tried to steal my future, my dignity, and ultimately my life. But they made one crucial mistake. They assumed that people like us would never find the courage to stand together against organized oppression. The verdicts, when they came after 3 days of deliberation, were as comprehensive as the crimes they addressed. Surviving mine guards received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years in territorial prison, while foremen who had orchestrated violence faced life imprisonment or death sentences, depending on their specific roles in murders and systematic intimidation. More importantly, Judge Morrison issued sweeping rulings that voided all land transfers and water rights agreements obtained through fraud or coercion, restoring property to rightful owners, and establishing new regulations governing mining operations throughout territorial jurisdiction. The binding rulings under territorial statute established would protect individual rights against corporate exploitation for decades to come. But the trial's most significant outcome was Morrison's formal establishment of the Willow Springs Compact as a model for territorial development that served all citizens regardless of race or previous condition. The successful partnership between Nora and Chayton would be replicated in other regions, where conflict between settlers and tribal communities threatened to explode into violence that served no one's interests except corporate profiteers. The events in Willow Springs demonstrate that justice is possible when good people choose cooperation over conflict. Judge Morrison concluded in his final ruling, "This court hereby establishes federal support for similar cooperative arrangements throughout the territories with appropriate funding and legal protection for communities that choose mutual assistance over racial warfare." As the courtroom emptied and justice ground toward its inevitable conclusion, Nora found herself walking beside Chayton through streets that had been transformed by their shared struggle. Businesses that had been shuttered during Dietrich's reign of terror were reopening under local ownership. Families were returning to homesteads they had been forced to abandon, and children played in areas that were no longer patrolled by corporate guards with license to intimidate and kill. The physical reconstruction of Willow Springs proceeded alongside the more important work of rebuilding trust and cooperation between communities that had been taught to see each other as natural enemies. Helen and Robert Victoria had reopened the school with expanded programs that served both settler and tribal children, while Dr. Malcolm's practice continued under federal supervision that ensured proper medical ethics and community service. Timothy Walsh had been appointed as the town's new sheriff, his courage during the final confrontation earning him community trust that transcended his humble origins as a medical assistant. His first official acts included establishing joint patrols with Lakota warriors, creating practical cooperation that would prevent future exploitation by outside forces seeking to divide and control the territory. But perhaps the most significant change was the construction project that had begun on the creek, that ran through Nora's restored property, a cabin that would serve as both home and headquarters for the federal mediation program, that would extend the Willow Springs model to other territories facing similar challenges. The morning sun cast long golden rays across the valley, where Nora's cabin was finally nearing completion, its sturdy log walls and stone foundation representing far more than simple shelter. 6 months after the trial that had established the Willow Springs Compact as territorial law, the building had become a symbol of cooperation between peoples who had learned to value partnership over prejudice and justice over corporate submission. Chayton worked beside her, with the same methodical competence he brought to every task, his skilled hands shaping the final timber that would complete the structure they had planned as both home and headquarters for their expanded responsibilities as federal mediators. The ceremonial war bonnet remained carefully stored for official occasions, but the man who wore it had found ways to serve both his people's interests and his growing commitment to the woman who had become far more than a temporary ally. The federal appointment had materialized exactly as Judge Morrison had promised, providing them with authority, resources, and protection needed to establish cooperative arrangements in territories where racial conflict threatened to explode into the kind of violence they had experienced. More importantly, their work was already showing results in regions where corporate interests had previously exploited divisions between communities to advance their own agenda at everyone else's expense. "Hand me that level," Nora said, checking the alignment of a door frame that would soon welcome visitors from throughout the territorial system who came seeking practical solutions to problems that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Their hands touched as Chayton passed her the tool contact that had become natural through months of shared labor on projects both professional and personal. The easy intimacy between them spoke to partnership that had been tested in crucibles of danger and emerged stronger for the experience. But it also reflected something deeper that neither had expected when circumstances first brought them together. Helen Victoria appeared on the path from town, carrying a basket that promised fresh bread and news from the continuing federal investigations that had spread far beyond Willow Springs to encompass mining operations throughout the territories. The schoolteacher had regained community trust through months of dedicated service, her experience with corporate coercion providing valuable insights for preventing similar manipulation in other settlements. "Your Uncle Edward sent a letter," Helen announced, producing correspondence that bore the territorial postal seal and Edward Marcel's distinctive handwriting. "He's been cleared of all criminal charges and wants to visit when the cabin is finished. Says he has something important to discuss about your parents' original homestead claim." The prospect of reconciliation with her uncle carried emotional weight that Nora hadn't fully anticipated. Edward had raised her after her parents' deaths, and despite his weaknesses and the pain his gambling had caused, he remained her closest family connection in a world where kinship often meant the difference between prosperity and destitution on the unforgiving frontier. But Helen's next announcement brought news that would transform their understanding of territorial politics and reveal opportunities that neither had dared to imagine during their desperate flight from corruption and violence. There's also an official envelope from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Helen continued producing documents that bore federal seals and suggested possibilities that extended far beyond local mediation work. "Washington wants to expand your program to include railroad negotiations and mineral rights disputes. They're offering permanent appointment to a new special commission under the territorial governor. The position would carry significant authority over corporate activities that affected both settler and tribal communities, with federal backing that would make their decisions legally binding throughout the territorial system. More importantly, it offered them a way to make their partnership genuinely significant in the larger struggle to build just societies on the frontier, where cooperation could replace exploitation as the dominant model for development. Federal protection comes with the appointment," Helen added with obvious excitement. "Anyone who interferes with your work would be answering directly to Washington, rather than local authorities who might have conflicting interests or allegiances." As afternoon shadows lengthened across their nearly completed home, they were joined by unexpected visitors who would provide the final surprise in a story that had begun with theft and desperation, but was ending with hope and partnership. A mixed group of families, some Lakota, some settler, some representing other tribal nations, came walking up the creek path, carrying tools and materials for a traditional barn raising. Winona led the Lakota contingent, her presence representing tribal approval for her brother's choice of partner and life direction. Beside her walked Robert Victoria, fully recovered from his months of imprisonment and eager to contribute his engineering expertise to construction projects that served community needs rather than corporate profits. Time to finish this properly. Winona announced in English, her words carrying the weight of cultural ceremony as well as practical construction needs. A home should be completed by the community it will serve. What followed was a celebration of cooperation that would have seemed impossible during the dark months when Dietrich's corruption had poisoned relationships throughout the territory. Families who had been taught to fear and distrust each other worked side by side, sharing skills and knowledge, while their children played together without regard for racial boundaries that adults had learned to ignore. As the sun began to set over their completed cabin, Chayton and Nora stood together in the doorway, watching their friends and neighbors pack up tools and prepare for the journey back to their own homes. The work had been completed with remarkable speed and efficiency, but more importantly, it had demonstrated that the Willow Springs Compact was more than just legal theory. It was a practical reality that was transforming how people lived and worked throughout the territory. "There's something I want to give you," Chayton said softly as the last visitors disappeared down the path toward town. From inside his shirt, he produced a leather bracelet decorated with intricate beadwork that represented months of careful craftsmanship during quiet evening hours. The patterns woven into the leather told stories of partnership and mutual respect that transcended cultural boundaries, while the materials themselves, beads traded from distant tribes, leather from buffalo hunted on traditional grounds, connected their relationship to larger networks of cooperation and exchange. "It's beautiful," Nora whispered, extending her wrist so he could fasten the bracelet with gentle precision. "It represents promises," Chayton replied, his voice carrying the weight of commitment that went far beyond romantic gesture. "Promises between us, between our peoples, and between everyone who chooses cooperation over conflict. In my people's tradition, when a warrior gives such a gift to a woman who has proven herself in battle, it speaks of partnership that will endure through all seasons." The kiss that followed was tender but passionate, speaking to partnership and mutual respect that had grown from shared trials rather than simple attraction. It was the kind of connection that frontier life demanded, practical but genuine, born of tested loyalty rather than romantic illusion, and strong enough to withstand whatever challenges their expanded responsibilities might bring. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky above their valley, they stood together, planning futures that would take them throughout the territories, but would always bring them home to each other and to the community they had helped to build. In the distance, the creek flowed steadily toward the horizon, carrying life to settlements that had learned to share resources rather than fight over them, just as their love would carry hope to regions still trapped in cycles of violence and mistrust. Behind them, the cabin waited with patient promise of shelter and security for whatever adventures lay ahead. Before them, the path led toward opportunities to expand their partnership into a force for justice and cooperation throughout territories where courage was still more valuable than gold, and love could indeed triumph over the worst impulses of human nature. The river ran clear, the future beckoned bright, and their story was ready to begin its next chapter in a world they had helped to make better through determination, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that different peoples could learn to trust and cherish each other across every barrier that prejudice and corporate greed could devise to keep them apart.